Imagine a modern country waking up one morning and discovering that several of its states have simply decided to leave, not just politically disagree, not vote differently, leave entirely, form their own government, raise their own army, and point cannons at the former nation they belonged to only months earlier. That was the United States in 1861. A country barely 85 years old suddenly fractured into two hostile governments, each convinced it represented the true future of the nation. The conflict that followed would become the deadliest war in American history, killing more people than every other American war of the 19th century combined. Entire cities burned. Massive armies clashed across fields, forests, and rivers. Families found themselves divided, with brothers sometimes fighting on opposite sides of the same battlefield. But the war did not begin with soldiers marching. It began with a question the country had avoided answering since its founding. Could a nation built on the principle of liberty continue to allow slavery? For decades, politicians tried to delay the answer. Eventually, the question demanded a decision. And when it did, the United States exploded into civil war. By the middle of the 19th century, the United States looked unified on maps. But in reality, the country was operating like two separate civilizations sharing the same government. In the northern states, the economy was transforming rapidly. Factories produced textiles, tools, machines, and consumer goods. Cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Boston were expanding at incredible speed as immigrants arrived from Europe searching for work. Railroads connected towns and industrial centers, allowing goods to move across the country faster than ever before. If the North had a personality, it looked like an early version of modern capitalism. Factories, industry, railways, and expanding cities. The southern states developed in a very different direction. Their economy revolved around agriculture, especially cotton production. Cotton was one of the most valuable commodities in the world at the time. European textile factories depended heavily on cotton grown in the American South. The system that made these plantations profitable was enslaved labor. Millions of enslaved African Americans were forced to work fields under brutal conditions to produce crops that enriched plantation owners. By the 1850s, the Southern economy depended on slavery so deeply that many plantation owners believed the entire regional system would collapse without it. So the United States contained two economic worlds. One region slowly modernizing through industrial growth, the other fiercely protecting an agricultural system built on slavery. And both regions believed their survival depended on the future direction of the country. For decades, American politicians tried to prevent this conflict through political deals. Every time a new territory or state entered the Union, Congress had to decide whether it would allow slavery. If too many slave states joined, the South would dominate national politics. If too many free states joined, slavery could eventually be outlawed entirely. To maintain balance, lawmakers created temporary solutions. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 attempted to divide the country geographically between slave and free territories. Later agreements, like the Compromise of 1850, tried to calm tensions by adjusting political representation and territorial boundaries. These deals worked the way temporary patches work on a leaking dam. They slowed the pressure, but they did not remove it. Every time the United States expanded westward, the argument returned, and each time it came back louder. By the 1850s, the debate had grown so intense that violence began breaking out even before the Civil War officially started. In the Kansas Territory, pro-slavery and anti-slavery groups attacked each other in a chaotic conflict known as Bleeding Kansas. Armed groups burned towns, raided settlements, and fought small battles over the future of slavery in the territory. The nation was already drifting toward war. In 1860, the political situation reached a breaking point. A relatively unknown politician from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln ran for president representing the Republican Party. Lincoln's position was simple but explosive. He opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories. Southern leaders viewed this as an existential threat. If slavery could not expand westward, they believed it would eventually be surrounded by free states and gradually abolished. When Lincoln won the election, many Southern politicians concluded that their influence in the federal government had collapsed, and they responded dramatically. Beginning with South Carolina, Southern states announced they were leaving the United States entirely. This process was called secession. Within months, 11 states had formed a new country called the Confederate States of America. They elected Jefferson Davis as president and began organizing a national government. Imagine if several American states today simply declared independence and formed their own nation. That was the crisis facing the United States in 1861. The war finally began in April of 1861, but by the time the first cannon fired, the political crisis had already reached a point where violence was almost inevitable. In Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, a small Union military installation known as Fort Sumter stood on an artificial island of stone and brick. The fort had been constructed decades earlier to defend the harbor from foreign naval attacks, but now it had become something far more symbolic. It represented the authority of the United States government in a region that had declared itself independent. South Carolina had already seceded from the Union months earlier, and Confederate leaders believed that any remaining federal military presence inside their territory was unacceptable. To them, Fort Sumter was not just a defensive structure sitting in the harbor. It was a reminder that the United States still claimed authority over land the Confederacy considered its own. Confederate officials demanded that the Union garrison inside the fort surrender the installation peacefully. The commander of the fort, Major Robert Anderson, refused. Anderson's position was extremely difficult. The fort contained only a small number of soldiers and limited supplies. Food was running low, ammunition was scarce, and the fort's defensive capabilities were far weaker than its imposing walls suggested. Across the harbor, Confederate forces had positioned heavy artillery on nearby land and fortified islands, effectively surrounding the installation with cannons pointed directly at its walls. Negotiations dragged on for weeks while tensions continued to rise. Then, shortly after dawn on April 12, 1861, the standoff finally collapsed. A Confederate artillery battery fired the first shot toward Fort Sumter, launching a shell high into the sky before it exploded above the fort's walls. Within moments, dozens of Confederate cannons joined the bombardment, turning the quiet harbor into a storm of smoke, thunder, and flying iron. For more than 30 hours, artillery shells rained down on the fort. Inside the walls, Union soldiers attempted to return fire using the limited cannons they could safely operate. But the Confederates controlled the surrounding high ground, giving them a major advantage. Each explosion shook the fort's interior structures, and thick clouds of gunpowder smoke filled the air. Eventually, fires broke out inside the fort as shells struck wooden buildings and supply areas. Major Anderson realized that continuing the fight would accomplish nothing except destroy the fort entirely and risk the lives of his men. On April 13th, the Union garrison agreed to surrender. Remarkably, no soldiers had been killed during the bombardment itself, but the political consequences were enormous. The United States had just witnessed armed conflict between two governments claiming to represent the same nation. The country was now officially at war with itself. At first, many people believed the conflict might still remain limited. Politicians in both the North and the South predicted quick victories. Newspapers printed confident statements, suggesting that one decisive campaign would force the opposing side to surrender. Volunteers flooded recruitment offices. Young men rushed to join regiments, convinced they were about to participate in a brief patriotic struggle that might last only a few months. Some soldiers even brought picnic baskets and personal cameras when they marched toward early battlefields, treating the experience almost like a grand national spectacle. The illusion did not survive the first major confrontation. In July of 1861, Union and Confederate forces clashed near a small stream called Bull Run. Not far from Washington, D.C., thousands of soldiers from both sides advanced across open terrain, attempting to outmaneuver each other while artillery thundered across the hills. The battle quickly dissolved into chaos. Confederate reinforcements arrived unexpectedly. Units became disorganized. Officers struggled to maintain control as smoke, noise, and confusion overwhelmed the battlefield. Eventually, the Union Army began retreating. What began as an orderly withdrawal soon turned into a chaotic stampede as frightened soldiers fled toward Washington alongside civilians who had come to watch the battle from nearby hills. The Battle of Bull Run shocked the entire country. The war would not be quick. It would not be glorious. and it would not end in a matter of months. Instead, the United States had entered a conflict that would grow into one of the most destructive wars of the 19th century, transforming landscapes into graveyards and leaving entire communities permanently scarred by the violence that followed. The Civil War arrived at a moment when technology had advanced faster than military strategy. Weapons were more powerful than in previous wars. Rifled muskets could fire accurately at long distances. Artillery could devastate large formations of soldiers. Railroads allowed armies to move supplies and troops quickly, but battlefield tactics still resembled those used in earlier centuries. Commanders ordered soldiers to march across open fields in tightly organized formations. Against modern weapons, these tactics were catastrophic. Battles often produced enormous casualties in a matter of hours. At Antietam in 1862, nearly 23,000 soldiers were killed or wounded in a single day, making it the bloodiest day in American military history. The war was evolving into a grinding industrial conflict. At the beginning of the war, the Union's goal was preserving the United States. But by 1863, Abraham Lincoln transformed the conflict. He issued the Emancipation Proclamation. The proclamation declared that enslaved people in Confederate territory were now free. Although it did not immediately end slavery everywhere, it changed the purpose of the war. Now the Union was fighting not only to restore the country, but also to destroy the institution of slavery. It also allowed African American soldiers to join the Union Army. Nearly 200,000 black soldiers and sailors would eventually serve in the fight. Their participation played a crucial role in the Union's victory. By 1864, the Union had gained overwhelming advantages. The North possessed a larger population, stronger industry, and greater railroad networks. Union General Ulysses S. Grant launched relentless campaigns against Confederate forces. Meanwhile, William Tecumseh Sherman carried out one of the most controversial military operations of the war. Sherman's army marched through Georgia, destroying railroads, factories, and supply depots. The goal was to break the Confederacy's ability to sustain the war. The strategy devastated the Southern economy. By early 1865, Confederate resistance was collapsing. In April, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered his army to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The Civil War was over. The numbers were staggering. More than 600,000 Americans died. Cities were destroyed. Railroads were wrecked. The Southern economy had collapsed. Millions of enslaved people were now free. The United States had preserved its union, but the war left scars that would take generations to heal. The Civil War ultimately forced the United States to confront the contradiction that had existed since the country declared its independence in 1776. The Declaration of Independence had proclaimed that all men were created equal, yet the nation had simultaneously allowed millions of people to remain enslaved. For nearly a century, American politics had attempted to avoid resolving that contradiction through compromises, temporary agreements, and political maneuvering. The war ended that avoidance permanently. When the fighting stopped in 1865, the United States remained a single nation, and the institution of slavery, an economic and social system that had shaped the country for generations, was abolished through the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. But the Civil War did more than change laws. It revealed how fragile even a powerful nation can become when its citizens fundamentally disagree about the meaning of freedom, power, and human rights. The conflict demonstrated that political systems, no matter how stable they appear, can fracture when competing visions of society grow too far apart. Entire communities were left grieving. Cities and farms had been destroyed, even after the battlefield fighting ended. The struggle over equality, citizenship, and civil rights would continue for decades during the difficult period known as Reconstruction. More than a century and a half later, the Civil War remains one of the most powerful and debated chapters in American history. Historians, scholars, and citizens continue to examine the causes, consequences, and meaning of the conflict because its legacy still shapes the political and cultural landscape of the United States. The Civil War was never just a contest between armies marching across battlefields. It was a defining struggle over the identity of a nation, a struggle that determined whether the United States would remain divided between two incompatible systems, or evolve into a country committed, at least in principle, to the idea that freedom should apply to everyone,